That's exactly where he was stopped by Indrid Cold. It was about a mile south of Parkersburg. He was coming around the bend when he felt a tractor-trailer truck, he thought, coming up behind him without his lights on. It was about 6:30 in the evening. It was dark because it was November. It was misting a light rain. Mr. Dereburger pulled over to the side of the road, and much to his surprise, this craft rolled over his car about 10 feet ahead. It came straight down. It was a charcoal gray color craft vehicle, he often said on the tapes, vehicle. It was about 40 feet across, I think he said. It hovered 10 to 12 inches off the berm of the road. He did not see any lights whatsoever until a hatch opened. A man stepped out. After the man stepped out of the craft, it went straight up into the air about 70 feet, hovered over the road, the berm of the road. A man whom he described looked like any ordinary man on the street. There was nothing unusual about his appearance, except he wore a long, dark trench coat. He appeared to be about 35 years of age. He had dark hair slicked straight back, dark eyes, an olive-like complexion. He began walking toward Mr. Dereburger's car, which was a panel truck, and he heard these words. And the words he heard were, "Do not be afraid. I mean you no harm. I only want to ask you a few questions." And that is when Mr. Dereburger became afraid, because as the man talked to him, his lips did not move. Now, in describing this figure, he pretty much, there's two types of men in black. There's the one with the pale, pasty complexion, and then there's the other that I talked about that looks maybe a little bit Native American. They look ethnic in some way. So basically, Indrid Cold, in my opinion, was a typical man in black. Are they ephemeral, as the other speaker just talked about? No. They're real. They're solid. They're real. I've seen them. Okay? Now, he goes around to the side of the panel truck, and Mr. Dereburger becomes somewhat hypnotized. And the man leans down. He's about 6 feet tall. He leans down. He said, "Roll down your window. I want to talk to you." And Mr. Dereburger said he felt that when Indrid Cold looked into his eyes, he knew everything about him. So they had like a 5 to 10 minute conversation on the outside of Parkersburg. And he introduced himself as Cold at the time. From a country less powerful than yours. I never knew what that meant. Cars were passing during this conversation. It's raining. Indrid Cold points to the lights of Parkersburg and said, "What do you call that?" And Mr. Dereburger said, "Well, that's Parkersburg." He actually said, "That's Parkersburg." He said, "We call that a city." And Indrid Cold said to him, "Where I come from, we call it a gathering." And at this time, Mr. Dereburger was becoming very nervous, very unnerved. And Indrid Cold noticed this, and he said, Why are you frightened? I mean you no harm. He said, we only wish you happiness. We only wish you happiness. But, as with many men in black, there was a malevolent quality to Indrid Cold. So, he said, he asked him about the livestock of the area, and when he pointed toward Parkersburg, he said, do people live there? Do they work there? Yes, yes, they live and they work there. And Indrid Cold supposedly said, well, what do you do? And Woodrow Dereburger said, I'm a salesman. And Indrid Cold said to him, well, I'm a searcher. I'm a searcher. That's how he described his profession, as a searcher. And Woodrow Dereburger later said he felt that Indrid Cold didn't care about any of these things. What he cared about was keeping up a communication with him. So finally, Indrid Cold said to Woodrow Dereburger, thank you for the conversation. I'll see you later, and we will see you again. We will see you again. And at the moment, and Indrid Cold said we. At the moment, Indrid Cold said, we will see you again. The spacecraft comes straight back down, 10-12 inches, hovers off the berm. Again, charcoal gray, no lights, until the hatch opens. A human arm extends, pulls Indrid Cold up into the craft, shoots back up in the air 50-60 feet, where it hovers for a few seconds. And basically, I have these interviews if anybody's interested. I'll talk about them a little bit, and I've listened to them over and over again. And then Mr. Dereburger says, and then it made it sound like that. He said it made it sound like that, and then it went at a very high rate of speed. Mr. Dereburger got to his farmhouse a few minutes after 7 in Mineral Wells, West Virginia. He was late. His wife met him at the door. And she said, what's wrong with you? What's the matter with you? He said, get me a glass of water and I'll tell you. Later, Mrs. Dereburger said he could not have been any whiter if he had been lying in a coffin. He describes this experience of being stopped by Indrid Cold. She becomes concerned. She goes in and she calls the West Virginia State Police. Mr. Dereburger did not call the police. Mrs. Dereburger did. He tried to go home go back to work the next day, but he wasn't able to, because all of the media was coming into Parkersburg with this story about this encounter that somebody had on I-77 with this alien in a spacecraft. So they did a live interview in Parkersburg on November 3rd, 1966. A lot of interesting history about the interview as well. They did a video interview with Mr. Dereburger and an audio. Had the audio as well. Very interesting to listen to, because you can hear him as they're asking him questions. You can hear his knuckles on the table. You can hear the knuckles hit the wooden table in emphasis over what he is saying. And as they're interviewing him, he is drawing a picture of the spacecraft, which looked like a chimney lamp. I suppose one of those things that, I'm not sure what a chimney lamp looks like, but one of those things shaped like that. And he's talking about this. So he's interviewed at this time by the Parkersburg City Police, Ed Plum, West Virginia State Police, representatives of the Wood County Airport. There were sends of people in from Washington, D.C., and they were sending in a representative from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, but he was not there yet. In these interviews, it's very interesting because they'll say, well, Mr. Dereburger, did you stop at a bar on your way home? Have you ever had a nervous breakdown? Have you ever taken medication for your nerves? He said, Mr. Dereburger, did you go to church? Are you a truthful person? You know, all these interesting questions. And what strikes me the most, and there's a lot of people that don't believe Woodrow Dereburger's story, thinking that he fabricated a lot of it. And I have to say, there are a few things that says he did not fabricate the initial story. And those are that his wife called the police. He didn't call. It preceded the first Mothman sighting by about 10 days, I think. And there are other elements to the story that are very much in keeping with other UFO tales. Did he embellish the story later? Yes. His wife said that later he did embellish the stories in order to sell his book. But what really strikes me in listening to these tapes, and I have them if anybody have the CD, is the reporter Glenn Wilson. He's the one that gave them to me. He thought maybe I'd like to have them. He told me that, now he only had the audio. He told me that the video came up missing mysteriously. So if you've ever followed into these stories about the Men in Black, that sort of makes sense. But anyway, he had these, and I had them transposed and on a CD. The old reel-to-reel tapes. I've got them, and it was so funny of watching the Mothman prophecies and hearing, you know, the story of Gordon Smallwood. They've got him in the overalls like he's a farmer. Well, Mr. Dereburger had a farmhouse. He didn't have a farm. He lived in a farmhouse. And he wasn't a farmer. He was a sewing machine salesman. He worked for J.C. Penney's, is who he worked for. Glenn Wilson says, he's the one that gave me the old tapes before he retired. He said, well, Mr. Dereburger, if Indrid Cold said to you, I mean you no harm, and he was very pleasant to you, why is it you still seem so frightened? He said, because Cold said to me, we will see you again. And Mr. Wilson, that's what I'm afraid of. So that's the story of Indrid Cold in Parkersburg. There are claims that he would come back, visit with Mr. Dereburger. Mr. Dereburger would come up missing. It's a long, twisted tale. Woodrow Dereburger died in 1988, I think it was. No, wait a minute, 1994. It was in the 90s that he passed away. So we have all these mysterious happenings in that time, going from 1966 to 1967, and they definitely happened. I was witness to much of them. So that's the story. Does anyone have any questions? Any questions about the Men in Black, Indrid Cold? None? Come on. Well, the Center Point Banshee is a really fascinating story, and it's too long to tell here. I'm just amazed that in the same small town you have two red-eye portents of doom, which in 1918, during the Spanish flu, the Black Flu, you had a banshee spirit that appeared to a family. And then in 1966, you had the Mothman that appeared to a family. A lot of the stories about the banshees, I've got two of them in here, Cry the Banshee, a whole lot of stuff on Indrid Cold. And also a lot of new things on the West Virginia Mothman in my book, Cry the Banshee, History and Hauntings of West Virginia and the Ohio Valley. And I also have the CDs from the actual interviews of Woodrow Dereburger being interviewed on November 3rd, 1966. And before John Keel passed away, I was able to give him a copy. And he was stunned. I think when I gave it to him, he didn't believe it was real. Because you see, these tapes have been lost for many, many years. And the original tapes are in my cedar chest in my home in Parkersburg. I'll probably give them to a museum one day. Right now they're in safekeeping. But we have had those interviews transcribed to CD, where you can hear the voice of Woodrow Dereburger. So that's my presentation for today, and thank you.
Hi, Rosemary Ellen Guiley. I'm going to be the next speaker, but we're going to take a little break of about 10 minutes here so I can get set up.